The old man in room 308 hadn't spoken in days, until one night, as Nurse Jasmine adjusted his IV, he whispered, "I don't deserve kindness, especially from someone like you." Her blood ran cold. What did he mean by someone like you? His voice cracked with something deeper than pain, something like guilt twisted with shame. And for the first time, she saw not just a patient, but a man hiding from a past he thought no one would ever uncover. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The man in room 308. The fluorescent lights buzzed like static in Jasmine Carter's ears as she pushed her med cart down the sterile hallway of floor 3. It wasn't the sound that bothered her. It was the weight of the shift, the subtle looks exchanged between colleagues when certain patients' names came up, the unspoken agreements about who was worth the effort and who wasn't. This floor wasn't just where patients went to heal. It was where the forgotten were stored until they either got better or disappeared. When Jasmine saw the name Walter Gaines scrawled on the intake sheet in barely legible penmanship, something in her paused. It wasn't recognition. It was instinct. Something about the red flag labels and the lack of detail. Uncooperative, potentially aggressive, police involvement. No mention of family. No emergency contact. No backstory. Just another body in a system that thrived on silence. Room 308 was colder than the others, its walls barer, as if the room itself had surrendered to indifference. Jasmine's first glimpse of Walter was startling not because he looked dangerous, but because he didn't. He looked erased. Skin clung to bone, lips cracked, eyes ringed with shadows. His presence was like a question mark in a place that demanded answers before compassion. She stepped in, confident but not forceful. "Good evening, Mr. Gaines. I'm Jasmine. I'll be looking after you tonight." His eyes moved, tracking her, but his mouth remained closed. That silence wasn't the kind that comes from arrogance. It was the silence of someone who hadn't been spoken to like a human in a long time. She'd seen it before. In prisons, in shelters, in the mirror of her past. Without another word, she set about her tasks, not with detachment, but with precision and care. She cleaned the caked blood from his temple with warm saline. She checked the IV line, noting the bruises that painted his arms like a grim mosaic. She raised the head of his bed, adjusted his gown so it didn't choke him, placed a fresh blanket over his legs. She brought him a second tray when he barely touched the first, not because she thought he'd eat it, but because dignity sometimes came in the form of a warm roll and a carton of milk. The other nurse at the station, Karen, raised an eyebrow when Jasmine returned. "You don't have to waste your energy on him, Jazz. He's a nobody, Hesman." Fragments of a forgotten past. Jasmine. Carter moved like a thread stitching time together, quiet, constant, unnoticed by most. But to Walter Gaines, she became the only sign that he hadn't vanished completely. Though he never called her by name, his gaze began to linger longer when she entered, no longer avoiding her face as he once had. He watched her with the haunted stillness of someone weighing whether or not to let another human matter again. By the third night, Jasmine no longer checked the chart before entering room 308. She knew his vitals by memory, knew the rasp of his breathing, the subtle way his fingers trembled when he tried to feed himself. She'd sit quietly sometimes, saying nothing, just wiping his brow or gently adjusting his blanket when the air got cold. But that night was different. As she finished securing the IV tubing with practiced hands, she heard it. Faint, but deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." Jasmine looked up sharply. His voice was gravel, brittle with disuse. "Why not?" she asked, not expecting an answer. "I don't deserve kindness," he murmured, "especially from someone like you." The room stood still. The weight of his words hit her like a slap wrapped in velvet. Her spine straightened. "What do you mean? Someone like me?" Walter's eyes retreated. The shutters fell. He turned his head to the wall, saying no more. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was carved, deliberate, heavy with history. Jasmine stepped out, her heartbeat louder than her footsteps, her mind reeling with questions. She didn't know why, but she couldn't let it go. The ache in his voice wasn't guiltless, it was remorseful, and that distinction mattered. Over the next few days, she became a quiet investigator, tracing the outline of a man the world had already erased. The janitor, Rick, recalled a name from somewhere. Wall Street guy, big shot once, thought he was untouchable. A social worker scoffed. Racist old fossil got what he deserved. No one ruins their own life like that without a reason. But Jasmine wasn't convinced. Walter's hands, battered but elegant, held memories in their tremble. His posture, even in pain, had a kind of discipline. This wasn't just some aging misanthrope wasting away in self-inflicted exile. One evening, while replacing his hospital gown, Jasmine spotted something lodged deep in the pocket of a tattered overcoat folded on the chair. She pulled out a brittle newspaper clipping, yellowed and creased like forgotten currency. Her breath caught. Corporate whistleblower exposes bank's role in apartheid-era exploits. There he was, Walter, decades younger, standing outside a courthouse, lips tight, eyes burning with defiance. The article told of a financial analyst who risked everything to leak evidence that a major American bank had funneled illicit funds to prop up the apartheid regime in South Africa. The leak led to lawsuits, protests, and ultimately his career's death sentence. Blackballed, beaten, forgotten. Jasmine sat down, the article shaking in her hands. This man, buried beneath layers of neglect and whispers, hadn't just stood for something. He'd lost everything for it. The weight of guilt. Jay Asmine stood in the dimmed corridor for a moment before entering. The paper in her hand was thin, nearly translucent at the folds, as if time itself had tried to erase it. But the words were still there. The headline, the grainy photograph, the story of a man who once shook institutions, now reduced to a patient in a quiet hospital room no one wanted to enter. When she pushed the door open, Walter looked up, not with surprise, but with the detached weariness of someone used to being disturbed but never truly seen. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows across his gaunt features. She said nothing at first, just approached the bed, pulled a chair closer than usual, and laid the clipping across the blanket on his lap. "Is this you?" Her voice was quiet, but clear. He stared at it, unmoving. His fingers didn't twitch, his breath didn't change, but something behind his eyes cracked. His lips parted, and it took effort for the words to crawl out. "That life, it's long gone." Jasmine leaned in. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" A silence followed that seemed to stretch decades. Then, "What would have been the point? No one listens to a man like me anymore. Not when you're old, homeless, and forgotten. Not when the world's moved on and you're just wreckage from a storm they don't even remember." Jasmine's throat tightened, but she wouldn't let her voice betray her. "Your story still matters." He looked at her, truly looked, for the first time, as if searching for deception in her face, but he found only conviction. He shook his head slowly. "You don't get it. I really believed that doing the right thing would protect me. That if I burned everything down to reveal the truth, someone, somewhere, would catch me. I was wrong. People don't care about integrity. They care about headlines. And when the ink dries, they move on." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and his eyes glossed over with restrained tears. "I wasn't expecting a reward. he said hoarsely, "but I didn't think I'd be erased." Jasmine leaned forward, her hand hovering inches above his, not touching, but close. "They failed you, not the other way around." Walter blinked rapidly, and for a moment his lips quivered like he might respond. But instead, he turned his head toward the window, where night cloaked the city in silence. It was the posture of someone used to not being believed, and too tired to hope otherwise. Jasmine rose slowly. She folded the clipping with reverence and slipped it into her coat pocket. That night, she didn't cry, but her anger moved like molten steel beneath her skin. The kind of anger that didn't explode, but sharpened into purpose. At her desk, beneath the sterile hum of hospital lights, she drafted a report to the ethics board, documenting every overlooked need, every unjust note in Walter's file. Then, with hands trembling from the weight of what she now carried, she opened her laptop. She began to type. He gave up his career to stop injustice. In return, the world gave him nothing. Let's change that. And then she clicked publish. Not for attention, not for praise, but because some men deserve to be remembered, especially the ones the world worked hardest to forget. The man the world ignored. The news spread like a spark to dry brush, quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. Jasmine hadn't expected much when she clicked publish, only that it felt necessary. But within hours, the crowdfunding campaign began to ripple outward, picked up by voices hungry for something real, something human. Journalists unearthed archived footage of a young Walter Gaines standing alone before congressional hearings, holding binders of damning evidence with shaking hands. Activists reposted scans of the very documents he leaked, now taught in university courses as turning points in the financial dismantling of apartheid support. And then came the stories. Old colleagues emerged from the silence of their lives, some remorseful, others defiant. One, a retired banker, admitted on national radio, "We knew what he was doing. We just didn't have the courage to follow him." The irony wasn't lost on Jasmine. The same hospital executives who once flagged Walter as a risk now scrambled to issue statements. Meetings were called, legal teams briefed, and suddenly Walter Gaines, patient number 572341, was no longer a liability. He was a public relations opportunity. They moved him into a private suite, soothing blues instead of yellowed beige, filtered sunlight instead of humming fluorescence, new linens, new nurses, fresh fruit trays, and clinical apologies disguised as compliments. Jasmine watched it all unfold with a quiet fire behind her eyes. But Walter barely reacted. When they brought him a flat-screen television and a tailored bathrobe, he simply said, "I liked the quiet better." His body was too frail to fight, but his spirit, still scarred, still skeptical, remained intact. It wasn't comfort or recognition that touched him. It was Jasmine's voice, low and certain, as she stood by his bedside and said, "You matter. You never stopped." The words struck deeper than any headline, because they weren't for the world. They were for him. And he believed her. On his final night before discharge, Walter handed her an envelope. It was worn, soft at the corners, yellowed with age. She opened it carefully after he fell asleep. Inside was a handwritten letter, scrawled in tight, delicate script. "Your bravery saved my father's life. We never forgot you. Zanella M., Johannesburg." Jasmine read it twice, then again, before pressing it to her chest. In the hallway, beneath the artificial light of a place that had almost let him die, she cried, not from sadness, but from something more sacred, vindication. The next morning she watched from the main entrance as Walter walked out, cane in hand, each step more defiant than the last. A small crowd gathered. Activists, reporters, ordinary people moved by the story of a man who had once been cast aside. She smiled. Not because justice had been served perfectly, it rarely is, but because the world had finally opened its eyes. And for the first time in decades, Walter Gaines was seen